I've got a couple of things to say.
Yeah, please do.
So one thing is that they were, it's understood that they were deliberately buried.
Yeah, backfield, yeah.
And so that is something interesting to explore later on down the line. Another thing is that a lot of the animals depicted on the pillars, I'm not sure if you're going to mention this later, all but I think one depiction were male versions of the animals, which to my mind, as a psychologist, springs to mind that, well, if they're depicting the male animals, either they had a very strict patriarchy or more likely they were trying to communicate an idea about something. And I think that the main role of males in biology is to particularly protect offspring, and perhaps there was some sort of element of protection that they wanted to communicate in this temple. Maybe the fact that it was found alongside lots of animal bones, maybe they were saying, okay, protect us from the wrath of these animals we've killed in the afterlife. It's impossible to speculate, really. I mean, you can throw out plenty of ideas, but at the end of the day, there are any number of ways you could interpret why they did that. But I thought it was worth mentioning because it is very interesting, and it's obviously they knew the anatomy of animals inside out. And so it was a deliberate choice. It wasn't just a coincidence. They chose to depict it in that way. And the final thing I was going to say, to really backtrack a little bit, is you were talking about people cooperating to construct it. I thought it would be worth adding in a quick caveat that human beings had been cooperating even before we existed in the anatomically modern sense. So we covered in Contemplations at the site in Dmanisi, which is multiple millions of years old, that even before we were able to cook, we were hunting, a hominid was hunting animals, getting the meat, and chewing it up for one of their elderly relatives, presumed relatives, maybe they weren't, maybe they were an elderly friend, who knows, but they were chewing it up on behalf of them because they'd lost their teeth and would not be able to survive otherwise. So I think cooperation had existed in hominids and the human line for a very long time. So that aspect isn't necessarily novel, and I just wanted to stress that because it might be the first case of people cooperating to build a structure, but cooperation runs much deeper. And I always like to bring that up because it's quite an optimistic aspect of human nature. And as a psychologist, there aren't many. Most of the time it's just, this is a depressing aspect of our nature that is no longer useful to us, but is just a burden in modern life.
That was very interesting, that there was some exceptionally ancient hominids that were keeping their old folk alive like that. Because even today, even in today's nomadic peoples, quite often when an old person is no longer able to keep up with the herds, they're effectively sort of physically left behind to die of exposure.
Well, they still lived in quite a static society in Dmanisi in Georgia. This is obviously Georgia, the country, not the state. They had been there for hundreds of thousands of years before this point. So it seemed like a fixed society, if you will. It's not quite the right word, society, because it implies civilization, but it's the closest word we can use, I suppose.
It's interesting to note that you can be fully nomadic, where you literally go wherever the herds that you're living off go. Then there's sort of semi-nomadic, where you follow them a bit seasonally, or you realise that certain herds come through the same part of the world every year, and so you sort of stay more or less within that region, just wait for them to appear. So there's sort of all different degrees or shades of grey of being nomadic. They're sort of fully, fully nomadic, and then not so much.
There's a lot of nuance in many aspects of looking back at this time, isn't there? It's very difficult to make blanket generalizations about anything because there are always exceptions to the rule, even with our limited understanding.
But if there's anything that will save us, it is cooperation. like they say in Shaun of the Dead, when he reads it on the beer mat in Shaun of the Dead. So Göbekli Tepe is sort of many layers. That's the thing that makes it a bit more complicated. The oldest ones, obviously lower down, were deliberately filled in, backfilled, and then to make a small mound, and then other enclosures built on top of that, and they in turn were filled in, and so on, until you're left with an actual pot-bellied hill, an artificial hill. So where we mentioned before, I can't remember if it's on an Epochs or Contemplations, but it's a palimpsest. Quite often that word's used for writing. If you use the same bit of parchment or paper or papyrus, and you sort of scrub out what was on there and reuse it, and it's been used many times, a palimpsest.
I've never heard that word before. I always just called it being a cheapskate.
And if you're careful, you might be able to work out what was written on it earlier. So Göbekli Tepe, like lots of archaeological sites, it's an archaeological palimpsest. So there's many layers to it, essentially. It's an overly complicated way of saying that. And the lowest one we've got is layer 3. And there's 4 main enclosures there. You mentioned the word temple a moment ago. May or may not be a temple. Quite possibly is a type of temple. But anyway, just for a moment, call them enclosures. Imaginatively have been dubbed A, B, C and D.
I think that the term temple is perhaps a bit anachronistic,
Well,
but
we'll
invokes a
that.
certain sentiment is what I was going for.
So I wanted to leave that relatively towards the end. What's its purpose?
Okay,
but we're getting there anyway. We are actually getting there. And so these enclosures, they're not very big. They're like 10, 15 metres across. It's not that big.
It kind of suggests that they're not intended for habitation, right?
Definitely not. Well, there's no evidence on the site whatsoever for continual habitation. No evidence that the builders of it lived there. So, for example, around the the Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau, there's loads of evidence of the workers living there. And so, which makes sense. They sort of would have to have done. But there's none of that at Göbekli Tepe, which makes it even sort of weirder, even more enigmatic. How would what exactly was going on? But anyway, these enclosures are not all that big, which means even though it implies a relatively large community, at least probably in the hundreds of people at minimum, you can only get a handful of people in there at any given time. So it wasn't meant for whatever it was meant for. It wasn't a sort of a mass experience. You know, it's not like a cathedral, an abbey, or even a church where you can get dozens and dozens or even hundreds of people in. No, it would have been for a very, very small select number of people at any given time. Again, people can, I barely need to explain it because I'll be putting pictures up, people can see, but, perhaps if you're only listening to the audio. What it is, these enclosures, the oldest ones are more circular or oval shaped, the later ones are sort of more rectangular. And they've got walls, and set into the walls, at least of the oldest ones, are stone monoliths. And then right in the middle are 2 large stone monoliths, or you might call them megaliths, T-shaped. Very specifically T-shaped. The oldest ones are the biggest ones. That's weird as well. A little bit weird. Why did their ambition and even technical engineering ability or artistic ability seem to decline over the millennia?
I have
that's
a
another
theory
question.
about that, but I shall save it.
Okay. The biggest ones, the oldest ones, are about 5.5 meters tall. That's massive. I think probably something like 16 odd tons a piece. And into these megaliths that both are built into the walls of the enclosure and the 2 central ones are all sorts of stylized patterns. We've already mentioned all the different animals, but especially the ones in the middle, they seem to be stylized humans. Because if you look closely, and I'll put pictures up so it's made very clear, that they have got sort of in low relief more arms on them and hands that sort of come across the waist or on their hips, sort of that sort of area. Like quite odd, elongated, stylized arms and hands, long fingers. Some of them, the biggest, most famous ones, they're wearing a belt. And it looks like they've even got sort of wearing a fox pelt. But the head, these T-shaped stones, giant T-shaped stones, the head there's no face, there's no element of a face on it. It's just a T-shape, a blank T-shape. So that's so weird, because we do also know from other archaeological finds that people in that part of the world at that time were totally capable of carving faces. In fact, they did loads. In the backfill, they found loads of human faces, loads of stone worked to look like human heads, or even masks. There are quite a lot of human masks found. And in other places, the archaeologists... So the point is, they definitely knew how to carve heads and faces. And on these big Göbekli Tepe T-shaped monoliths, they chose not to put any human features.
It was certainly a stylistic choice.
Yeah, right, definitely.
And what do you think... Just going purely on your gut instinct, what do you think was the reasoning behind it, knowing what you know about the rest of the site?
Well, I can only really agree with what the great Klaus Schmidt came up with, is that, well, so one, we know they chose to do that deliberately.
Mm-hmm.
So they're human-like, but not human. So they not must be, but it seems likely they're either depicting gods or ancestors. It seems fairly... It's difficult to come to much other conclusion without really going off the main beam. If you're trying to still be reasonable, you're saying they're human-like, but they're not human. They're not the same as us.
I'm sure there'll be someone in the comments saying, yeah, they were all UFO landing pads and they were depicting the aliens.
Right. Well, yeah. The odd elongated fingers, there's something alien-like about them, but I'm not going to go there. I don't put any store in the ancient aliens thing.
No, of course.
As soon as there's a shred of evidence, I'll jump on the bandwagon. But there's no evidence. There is none. So, I think it may have been some sort of ancestor worship, or as you said, temple. You used the word temple. Mm-hmm. They could have been among the first gods, the depictions of the first proto gods, if you like, and therefore that would make these enclosures at Göbekli Tepe a type of temple, the earliest temple.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.